Welcome back to another deep dive into the world of Westeros. Today, we're exploring one of the most fascinating yet underappreciated figures from the Dance of the Dragons, Lord Cregan Stark, and his brief but impactful reign during what history remembers as the Hour of the Wolf. This is a story about honor, justice, and the long reach of northern power in the aftermath of the Targaryen Civil War. So let's journey to Winterfell and discover how a young Stark Lord shaped the future of the Seven Kingdoms in just 6 days. When we talk about the Starks in George R.R. Martin's universe, we often think of Ned Stark and his unwavering sense of honor that ultimately led to his downfall. But long before Ned walked the streets of King's Landing, another Stark brought northern justice to the capital, and unlike his descendant, this Stark actually survived the experience. Cregan Stark stands as one of the most formidable lords in Westerosi history, a man who commanded such respect and fear that he essentially ruled the Seven Kingdoms for 6 days without ever sitting the Iron Throne. Before we dive into the Hour of the Wolf itself, we need to understand who Cregan Stark was and how he became one of the most powerful figures in Westeros. Born in 108 AC, Cregan was the eldest son of Lord Rickon Stark and Gillian Glover. He grew up in the harsh climate of the north, being molded by the same values that would define House Stark for generations to come. Honor, duty, and the ancient ways of the old gods shaped young Cregan into a formidable warrior and leader. Tragedy struck early in Cregan's life. His younger brother died in 119 AC when Cregan was just 11 years old. This loss would profoundly affect him, creating a void that would later be filled, at least temporarily, by his friendship with Prince Jacaerys Velaryon. Then, when Cregan was only 13 years old, his father, Lord Rickon, passed away in 121 AC, making the young teenager the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. But here's where Cregan's story takes an interesting turn. His uncle, Bennard Stark, became his regent, as was proper for a lord so young. However, when Cregan turned 16 and came of age in 124 AC, Bennard was reluctant to relinquish the power he had grown accustomed to wielding. The relationship between uncle and nephew grew increasingly tense as Bennard delayed turning over full control of the North. This experience taught Cregan an important lesson about power and those who refused to give it up willingly, a lesson that would serve him well during the Dance of the Dragons. In 126 AC, at age 18, Cregan had had enough. He took decisive action, imprisoning his uncle Bennard and all 3 of Bennard's sons, finally claiming his birthright as Lord of Winterfell. This wasn't just about personal ambition, it was about understanding that sometimes power must be taken from those who hold it unjustly. This early experience with a regent who wouldn't step aside would later inform Cregan's sympathy for Rhaenyra Targaryen's cause. Shortly after securing his position, Cregan married Lady Ara Nori, a childhood friend who he genuinely loved. Their marriage seemed to promise happiness, but tragedy struck again in 128 AC when Ara died, giving birth to their son. Cregan named the boy Rickon after his late father, ensuring the Stark line would continue. This personal loss, the death of his beloved wife, further hardened Cregan and reinforced his connection to the old ways and the harsh realities of life in the North. Now, for over a century after Aegon's conquest, House Stark had largely stayed out of southern politics. The North was a world unto itself, vast and difficult to govern, requiring lords who focused on their own lands rather than the games played in King's Landing. But in 129 AC, when King Viserys I Targaryen died, and the realm split between supporters of his daughter Rhaenyra and his son Aegon II, the North could no longer remain aloof. Prince Jacaerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's eldest son and heir, flew north on his dragon Vermax to secure House Stark's support. This meeting between Jacaerys and Cregan would prove pivotal not just for the Dance of the Dragons, but for the relationship between House Stark and House Targaryen for generations to come. According to Grand Maester Munkun, the 2 young men got along remarkably well. Jacaerys, who had recently lost his younger brother Lucerys to Aemon Targaryen's attack, reminded Cregan of his own late brother. The prince, in turn, found in Cregan a kindred spirit. The two spent their time together hunting, drinking, and training, activities that allowed them to bond as warriors and friends. They even swore an oath of brotherhood, a sacred pledge in the eyes of both the old gods and the new. Different accounts exist about exactly what transpired at Winterfell. Septon Eustace claimed that Jacaerys spent his time trying to convert Cregan from the old gods to the faith of the Seven, though this seems unlikely given the Starks' deep connection to their ancient religion. Mushroom, the court fool whose accounts are often salacious and unreliable, told a more scandalous story involving Cregan's alleged bastard half-sister Sarah Snow, claiming that Jacaerys fell in love with her and they secretly married in the God's Wood. However, Archmaester Gildain expressed skepticism about Mushroom's tale, and many historians doubt whether Sarah Snow even existed. What we do know for certain is that Cregan and Jacaerys reached an agreement that Grand Maester Munkun called the Pact of Ice and Fire. The terms were clear. In exchange for House Stark's support for Rhaenyra's claim, the firstborn daughter of Prince Jacaerys would marry Cregan's son Rickon when they came of age. This wasn't just a military alliance, it was meant to bind the ancient houses of Stark and Targaryen through blood, creating a connection between ice and fire that would strengthen both dynasties. True to his word, Cregan pledged the North's support to the Blacks. He sent Lord Roderick Dustin, known as Roddy the Ruin, south with a host of older northern warriors called the Winter Wolves. These were men who chose war over another harsh northern winter, veterans who knew they might not survive the cold months ahead and preferred to die in battle with honor. They were formidable fighters, and their presence would prove crucial in several battles during the dance, but Cregan himself couldn't march south immediately. The north is vast, and winter was approaching. In 130 AC, when Rhaenyra fled King's Landing and found herself at Duskendale, Cregan sent word that he would gather a host of 10,000 men for her cause, though he couldn't march until after the harvest was complete. The North's harsh climate meant that timing military campaigns around agricultural needs was essential. You couldn't leave your people to starve just to fight someone else's war. Tragically, by the time Cregan was ready to march, much had changed. Jacaerys, his sworn brother, had been killed in the Battle of the Gullet. Rhaenyra had been betrayed, captured, and fed to Aegon II's dragon Sunfire at Dragonstone. The Pact of Ice and Fire, which had promised to unite their houses through marriage, would never be fulfilled because Jacaerys died without any children. But despite these losses, despite the fact that Rhaenyra was dead and the original terms of his oath were now impossible to honor, Cregan Stark marched south anyway. This is crucial to understanding his character. He didn't march for political advantage or because he still expected to gain from the alliance. He marched because he had given his word, and in the north, a man's word is sacred. In 131 AC, Cregan finally led his host south. Different sources report different numbers. Septon Eustace claimed 20,000 men, while Grand Maester Munkun believed it was closer to 8,000. Regardless of the exact number, it was a formidable force. Many of these men were what the North called surplus men, younger sons, unmarried men, or those without prospects who came south to fight rather than burden their families during the coming winter. These weren't desperate rabble though. They were hardy northern warriors, and they frightened even their allies. As Cregan marched, events in King's Landing moved quickly. The Rivermen under Kermit and Oscar Tully had already defeated Boros Baratheon at the Battle of the King's Road. When the combined forces of the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North approached King's Landing, Aegon II's position became untenable. His small council, recognizing the overwhelming force arrayed against them and knowing they couldn't win, suggested he surrender and take the Black, joining the Night's Watch to escape execution. But before any decision could be made, the king was found dead, poison on his lips. With both Rhaenyra and Aegon II dead, the realm crowned Rhaenyra's surviving son, the 11-year-old boy who would become King Aegon III Targaryen. The men of the Vale and the Riverlands were welcomed into King's Landing with relief. The war was over. The killing could finally stop. But then Cregan Stark arrived, and everything changed. When the northern host entered King's Landing, they brought with them an aura of dread. Stories told by Medric and Torrhen Manderly had given the Northmen a dark reputation, and their arrival struck fear into the hearts of both the small folk and even the victorious lads, the young river lords who had just helped win the war. Even bloody Ben Blackwood, who had proven himself a formidable warrior during the dance, found himself intimidated by Cregan's presence. At only 13 years old himself, Ben couldn't help but feel like a child when Cregan entered a room. Grand Maester Munkun described the scene vividly. The city was Cregan's, to do with as he wished. The Northmen had taken it without drawing a sword or loosing an arrow. Whether they were king's men or queen's men, stormlanders or seahorses, river lords or gutter knights, highborn or low, all deferred to him as if they had been born to his service. This is remarkable when you think about it. Cregan had no dragons, no fleet, no claim to the throne. He was simply Lord Stark, but his reputation and the strength of his army were enough to make him the most powerful man in Westeros. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the sea snake, had already sent peace envoys to Casterly Rock, Old Town, and Storm's End, offering terms to the great houses that had supported Aegon II. The war was over, or so everyone thought, but Cregan Stark had other ideas. He intended to continue the war, to march on these strongholds and punish the Lannisters, Hightowers, and Baratheons for their betrayal of Rhaenyra. His bloodlust wasn't mindless violence, it came from a place of honor. He had given his oath to support Rhaenyra's cause, and he meant to see justice done for her and her children. Cregan expected the peace terms to be rejected. If they were, he could continue the war with a clear conscience. But if the terms were accepted, attacking the former Green supporters would constitute breaking the king's peace and would be considered perjury. So Cregan waited. For 6 days, he held court in the Red Keep, essentially governing the Seven Kingdoms, while young King Aegon III was confined to Maegor's Holdfast for his own protection. These 6 days would become known as the Hour of the Wolf. The term itself is significant. In Westerosi timekeeping, the Hour of the Wolf refers to the darkest part of the night, that time between 3 and 5 in the morning when most deaths occur, when nightmares are strongest, when evil seems closest. It's the hour when wolves hunt, when darkness is deepest just before dawn. Grand Maester Munkun chose this name deliberately when writing his book The Dance of the Dragons. A true telling. It captured both the man, Cregan Stark, with his house's direwolf sigil, and the nature of the time itself, a dark, uncertain period when justice was harsh and mercy was rare. During those 6 days, messages arrived from Casterly Rock, Old Town, and Storm's End. The three widows, as the ruling ladies of these houses were called, accepted the peace terms. This should have ended Cregan's justification for continuing hostilities. The king's peace had been established, but Cregan was not satisfied. Yes, the war was over, but there was still the matter of Aegon II's death to address. Here's where Cregan's sense of honor becomes complex and fascinating. He had been Aegon II's enemy throughout the war. He had marched south to fight against him, to destroy his forces and install Rhaenyra on the throne. Yet, when Aegon II was murdered with poison rather than killed honorably in battle, Cregan was outraged. It wasn't about supporting Aegon personally, it was about the principle. In Cregan's worldview, shaped by northern values and the old ways, killing a king with poison was dishonorable, cowardly, and unacceptable regardless of what that king had done. Cregan arrested 22 men accused of involvement in Aegon II's death or of failing to prevent it. This included some very significant figures. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the legendary sea snake himself, was imprisoned despite his crucial role in securing peace. Lord Larry Strong, the cunning master of whisperers known as Larry's Clubfoot, was arrested. Sir Perkin the Flea, an opportunistic knight, was seized. Sir Giles Belgrave of the Kingsguard faced charges. All of these men, whether through action or inaction, stood accused of regicide. Young King Aegon III, advised by his half-sisters Bella and Rhaena Targaryen, intervened to save Lord Corlys. The 11-year-old king named Cregan Stark as Hand of the King, giving him the official authority to dispense justice, and then arranged for Corlys to be freed through a strategic marriage. Alysanne Blackwood, also known as Black Aly, agreed to marry Cregan Stark in exchange for Lord Corlys's life. This was more than just a political arrangement, it satisfied Cregan's sense of justice while ensuring that the realm's most experienced naval commander wouldn't be executed. Corlys returned to his position, his life spared by marriage pact rather than trial. For the remaining 20 accused men, Cregan offered a choice. 19 of them agreed to take the black, joining the Night's Watch, where they would serve the realm for the rest of their lives on the wall. This was considered a merciful option, a way to remove them from politics while still allowing them to live with some honor. But 2 men refused this option. Lord Larys Strong and Sir Giles Belgrave chose execution instead, perhaps seeing it as preferable to a life of cold exile in the far north. Cregan Stark followed the ancient tradition of House Stark. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. He personally beheaded both Larry Strong and Sir Giles Belgrave using ice, the Valyrian steel greatsword of House Stark that had been passed down through generations. This act was deeply symbolic. It showed that Cregan wasn't a tyrant who handed down death sentences from on high. He was willing to do the dark work himself, to look these men in the eyes and take their lives with his own hands. It's the same principle Ned Stark would follow nearly 2 centuries later, that sense of personal responsibility for justice. The day after the executions, having served officially as Hand of the King for just 1 day, Cregan Stark resigned his position. His justice had been done. The murderers of King Aegon II had been punished. The king's peace had been established. There was nothing more for him to do in King's Landing, and Cregan had no interest in playing the Game of Thrones. He declined a position on King Aegon III's Regency Council and prepared to return home to the north, to his son, to his duties as Lord of Winterfell. But not all of his army returned with him. Remember, many of these men were surplus soldiers, younger sons and unmarried men who had no prospects waiting for them in the north. Returning home would only mean their families struggling to feed additional mouths through the winter. So a solution was found that benefited everyone. In the Riverlands, widow fairs were organized where hundreds of northern soldiers met women who had lost their husbands during the Dance of the Dragons. Many marriages resulted from these fairs, allowing the Northmen to stay in the south, start new families, and help rebuild the war-torn Riverlands. This mixing of northern and southern bloodlines would have effects that rippled through Westerosi history. Other Northmen took different paths. Some sailed across the narrow sea with Hallis Hornwood and Timothy Snow, founding a free company called the Wolf Pact. These mercenary soldiers would fight in the wars of Essos, carrying northern fighting traditions and the dire wolf banner to foreign lands. Cregan himself returned to Winterfell and married Alysanne Blackwood, as promised, a marriage made to save Lord Corlys, but one that apparently grew into something more genuine. With Alysanne, he fathered 4 daughters, Sara, Alice, Raya, and Mariah. After Alysanne's death, he married a 3rd time to his distant cousin Lyanna Stark, with whom he had 5 more children, Jonel, Edric, Lyanna, Barthogen, and Brandon. Tragedy continued to mark Cregan's life. His eldest son Rickon, the boy he had named after his father and for whom the Pact of Ice and Fire had been made, died fighting in King Daeron I's attempted conquest of Dorne. The son who was supposed to marry a Targaryen princess perished in a war that never should have been fought. Despite having daughters who should have inherited, succession in the north followed male preference primogeniture, so Cregan was eventually succeeded by his 2nd son, Jonel Stark. Cregan lived a long life, earning the nickname the Old Man of the North. He remained a friend to the Night's Watch throughout his years, sending men and supplies to maintain the wall. He also dealt with threats from beyond the wall, destroying the freefolk raiding bands of Silas the Grim during the winter fever epidemic. According to legend, Cregan once matched swords with Sir Aemon Targaryen, the legendary Dragon Knight, who claimed that Cregan was the finest swordsman he had ever faced. This is extraordinary praise from one of the greatest knights in Westerosi history. When Cregan finally died, he was laid to rest in the crypts of Winterfell alongside his ancestors and the ancient kings of Winter. His legacy lived on through his descendants. His grandson Baron Stark, son of Brandon, would eventually become Lord of Winterfell, though he too met a violent end, killed by Dagon Greyjoy's Ironborn raiders during the reign of King Aerys Targaryen. So what does the Hour of the Wolf teach us about power, justice, and honor in Westeros? First, it demonstrates that northern power, when mobilized, can be decisive even without dragons or massive wealth. Cregan Stark commanded respect through reputation, military strength, and an unshakable sense of honor that made men trust his word even when they feared his judgment. Second, the Hour of the Wolf shows us the complexity of justice in a feudal society. Cregan wasn't interested in revenge for revenge's sake. He executed 2 men and sent 19 to the wall, but he also accepted political marriages and compromises that served the realm's need for peace. His justice was harsh but not indiscriminate. It was rooted in a code of honor that valued how a thing was done as much as what was done. Third, we see how the Starks' motto, "Winter is coming," shaped their entire approach to warfare and politics. Cregan couldn't march south immediately because the harvest had to come in first. Many of his soldiers stayed south because returning would burden their families. Every decision was filtered through the harsh reality of northern life, where winter wasn't just a season, but an existential threat that colored every choice. The Hour of the Wolf also reveals something crucial about the Stark character that would echo down through the generations to Ned Stark and his children. When Cregan gave his word to support Rhaenyra, he kept that word even after she died, even after the man he made the pact with died, even after the political situation had completely changed. He didn't march south for advantage, he marched because he had sworn an oath, and oaths mattered more than life itself. Finally, the story shows us the cost of civil war and how difficult it is to establish lasting peace after such conflict. The Hour of the Wolf brought a swift end to the euphoria following Aegon II's death. It established consequences for the war's crimes and set the tone for Aegon III's troubled reign. But it also showed that even harsh justice, when administered fairly and then set aside, could be accepted. Cregan didn't try to hold power. He didn't establish himself as a kingmaker or seek a permanent position at court. He did what he came to do, then went home. In a world of ambitious lords and political schemers, that kind of restraint was remarkable. The Hour of the Wolf stands as one of the most significant moments in the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. In just 6 days, a northern lord reminded the entire realm that power doesn't just come from dragons or gold or ancient bloodlines. It comes from reputation, from keeping your word, from being willing to do the hard things yourself rather than delegating the dirty work to others. Cregan Stark showed that Winter and the Wolf are forces that even kings must respect. When you watch House of the Dragon and see Cregan Stark's brief appearance in Season 2, remember that this is the man who will eventually terrify a capital city just by walking through its gates, who will execute criminals with his own hand, and who will demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is choose to give up power when their duty is done. The Hour of the Wolf wasn't about conquest or ambition. It was about honor, justice, and the enduring strength of the North, themes that George R.R. Martin would return to again and again throughout the Song of Ice and Fire. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of Westeros's most fascinating historical periods. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Cregan Stark's story, let me know in the comments what other characters or events from the Dance of the Dragons you'd like to see explored. Until next time, remember that winter is always coming, and the North remembers.